What I want to talk to you about is how do we respond? Is it real? Is it real for our organizations? And what are some of our other clients doing? In particular, they're doing well, and what are some of the mistakes that they're making? And so one of the themes around this is really how measurement has changed, and how we need to change both our measurement and how we react to it, respond to it. And then, of course, I'm hoping we're a small group today, I see around 14 attendees. So I'm hoping that although we can't interject during, you can send your messages or questions or comments in the chat throughout. And then when we get through this in about half an hour from now, then I'd be more than happy to engage you in a robust discussion in terms of how your own organization can cope with this. Okay, so let's set the scene. We've heard about the big quit. What is the big quit if you haven't heard about it? Well, I think the alarm bells really rang in the US. And that's, of course, our media and our hype and our news often comes from south of the border. And what happened in the US was in their second or third quarter, so the summer basically, they had more than 4 million people quit their jobs. And that really caused a shudder throughout the economy. And then when you compile those numbers for the entire year, that number rose to 11 million people quitting their jobs in the space of the year. And so the two questions to ask, well, yeah, that's south of the border. Is that really happening here? The short answer is the responses are mixed, but the numbers that we're seeing and I'm seeing as we continue to do pulses and engagement surveys and all that type of measurement, we're seeing anywhere between 25 and 40% that are saying that they're considering leaving their jobs after the pandemic. Even now, even during the pandemic. Well, what's different about that? I'll talk about in a second. And one very recent study, we haven't even presented it to our client yet. That's tomorrow. Cass will know what I'm talking about. Almost just a hair under half, 50% of this organization's employees are thinking about leaving. My goodness. We never saw that before. The average is about 25%. And so you'd think, okay, well, they're treating their employees poorly, yada, yada, yada. No, engagement is in the upper echelons. So you have a highly engaged workforce where half of them are thinking of leaving. Of course, the question is, well, what's going on? Why is this happening? Before I get to the why, what I want to do is dispel a couple of myths. The first is, oh yeah, well, we're a professional organization, we're office workers, we're in the government. That's the whole big quit thing is just hospitality. It's low wage workers. It's the Tim Hortons and McJobs that are all these folks are the ones that are leaving. Wrong again. 40% of white collar are saying that they'd rather leave their jobs than give up remote work. Remote work has become very popular. It's fundamentally changed the way that we're going to be working in the future. And the phenomenon, another thing is, well, it's just the young people. They're the ones, we knew millennials were more apt to leave their jobs before the pandemic, and that was true. That was true. In our surveys before, on average, we would have around 25% of folks say they were thinking of leaving. And that number was 30% among millennials. So there was already built in before the pandemic a greater propensity for younger folks to leave their jobs. But the phenomenon is consistent. It's happening in all age groups. It's not just the young folks. And in fact, the highest rates of resignations aren't in the young millennials, it's in the middle age groups. It's in the 35 to 54 age range. And some of those are the millennials, some of those are the older millennials. But it really is millennials and Xers combined. And I think that'll make sense when we get into the reasons. And it's not hospitality, tourism, and those front-facing workers that really took the brunt of the closures and the lockdowns. It's tech, it's healthcare. Those are where the resignations are highest. Healthcare we can understand, because we all know what the healthcare workers have been going through. It's been on the news almost every night. But tech, really? Where's that coming from? That's a little bit of a shocker. So the thing here is, this is not a new phenomenon. It's just happened very suddenly. It's been building and building and building for about 20 years. For 20 years, we've been talking about the declining workforce. We've been talking about retirements, accelerating retirements, which is part of this phenomenon now. But nobody really ever took it seriously, especially when we had economic contraction. So when in the early decade, when the economy wasn't all that great, nobody was thinking right now at that point, okay, well, labor force is shrinking, we're going to have trouble finding people. And then over the time, we saw millennials being more and more apt to leave. But if you look at these stats from a benchmark, I used to work jointly with Conference Board of Canada, and we shared a benchmark with another company. And you can see here in 2011, we saw around 1 in 4 people. Let me just put my handy dandy spotlight on here. I'll show you there. You go. So we saw about 1/4 of everybody were saying, and that's what I said before, they were thinking of accepting a job with another employer. That's the same now, right? The difference now is this prefer not to answer is really jumped. Whereas people were pretty, you always had about 10% folks that were saying, no, I'm not going to tell you because you're going to identify me. That number's jumped. And why is it jumped? For 2 reasons it's jumped. For the first reason is people don't really care. They're not going to answer. They're not giving the employer the benefit of the doubt. They're just saying, you know what, I'm going to leave when I'm going to leave. And the prefer not to answer, if you're thinking, well, yeah, that's probably because they just don't want to say yes openly. Well, there's some truth to that. When you start to combine those answers, you're getting close to 50%, right? And that's the real difference. And that's happened very, very suddenly over the 2021 phase. But the folks that have always been thinking about it, you know what? That number is pretty stable, and we can see that. So it's not new. It's just more sudden. The question is why? Why is this happening now? In some sectors, it's been about the layoffs and the job uncertainty, for sure. And that's really what's happened in tourism and hospitality. People have left those jobs and they're not coming back because they can't be certain that they're not going to be laid off again. And just the quality of the work, the flexibility or lack thereof, more likely, has said, you know what, that's basically, to be quite rude, or to quote a song, it's been, and I've read this actually this morning, it's to take this job and shove it mentality, right? But in the next slide, I'll show sort of the real reason, the structural reasons that permit that to happen, right? The other thing is working remotely has been extremely popular. Extremely popular. Our surveys are saying 80% plus of people don't want to go back to the office the way they were. But there's been consequences to that, is because we haven't really figured out how to do that properly. And individuals, not only organizations, but individuals have lost the boundary that comes with the commute. We used to have some boundary, yeah, our mobility and email and phone and all that. Some of us kept it on, but working from home really destroyed the boundaries for many people. And as a consequence, increased workload and increased stress that comes with that. Balance was an issue. And 35 to 40%, the 35 to 54-year-old age cohort, well, why are they leaving in greatest numbers? These are the folks in the sandwich generation. These are the folks that are rearing kids that are also had to stay home until very recently. These are the kids that have to take care of elderly parents, that many of which were in the long-term care fiasco that happened. So extreme stress. And just the pandemic, what happened was it forced people to really look, because when you're working at home, you're not surrounded by your colleagues, you're not surrounded by those distractions, and your mind tends to, because you are surrounded by the things that you care about, your whether it's your children, your pets, your home environment, the renovations and all that. And people were really questioning, why am I slogging this out? I really need to make a change in my life. And that's really the new thing that's happened. The other thing, and that's also a consequence of remote work, is people have had less support from their organizations. They've had less contact with their managers, and they have really had less connectedness, a social connectedness. The things that we never think about in the office are now that we don't have them, we're missing them a lot. And that has contributed to a lot of the mental health, stress, and well-being, and also the workload. Because when you're working in an office and somebody pops their head into your cubicle or your office and has a quick chat, it's a break. You break. It's not always great for productivity, but it is great for mental health. You break for a second, you have that conversation, you feel connected to your colleague, you go back to work. Those distractions aren't there anymore. So we're slogging it out, sitting behind our desks 8, 9, 10, 11 more hours per day without those social interactions and social distractions. And that's been replaced by the infamous Zoom meeting that we're having right now. So you're not getting up from your desk, you're not getting up from your screen, you're actually tied to your screen more. And all of that, all of these phenomena, when you put them all together, has basically said to a lot of people, I'm leaving. I can't change. And of course, many organizations, you'd be surprised how many organizations are thinking about going back to office policies the way they were. And like I said before, most would rather quit. But what is permitting this all to happen? And really, it's the grass is greener effect. So what happens in an economy where you have high turnover is the higher turnover in effect is actually exacerbating the big quit, because people are thinking, hey, if I don't like working in this restaurant, well, I can maybe get a better, more flexibility and better wages in that restaurant. So the grass is greener phenomenon is really what powers this. It's an engine. And it's a vicious circle that's turning faster and faster and faster, right? So that's not going to stop anytime soon. As a matter of fact, it'll probably accelerate for the next year or so, at least until the economy dampens. Now, the Bank of Canada is starting to think about raising interest rates next year. So as that happens and the economy begins to cool, and we don't have that growth anymore, that's then and only then will that cycle start to recede. So that's the situation that we find ourselves working in. But the question begging us all is, well, how do we deal with that, right? What's different now, and how do we deal with it differently than we did before? And the solution really lies in looking at two concepts: the employee cycle, or the employee life cycle, from beginning to end, cradle to grave, and your employer brand. And I'm going to explain those concepts a little bit more if for some of you, if they're a little bit new. I think if you're working in HR, these should not be new, but I'll set the scene with that. So employer brand is simply your reputation. It's the buzzword of brand caught on because of marketing and attraction, but your reputation as a place to work, and your value proposition in terms of how you affect that reputation, that is really the employer brand. What do people who are entertaining the possibility of working for you, working for your organization, think about your organization? But it doesn't stop just with the applicant or the potential applicant. Your employer brand is actually conditioned by the employee experience. Your existing employees dictate to a large extent your employer brand. And a very, very good example of that is Amazon. So Amazon has a terrible employer brand, but at the same time, and I'll say where I got that information, and I'm hoping somebody in Amazon doesn't work to it, but I'll be more than happy to defend that opinion if I'm challenged on it. But as an employer brand, it's really struggling. But at the same time, it's trying to, it's through its own marketing is actually trying to use the value proposition and completely change that brand. So there's a really dichotomy there. Why is the employer brand at Amazon struggling? Well, it really comes from the experience of many, many employees that have gone there, worked there, and really had a bad experience. And that bad experience now has percolated online in chat rooms and everything that people are looking at, from Glassdoor to Reddit to Facebook to even things like TikTok and YouTube, where that brand, when you ask somebody, especially in the Gen Z age cohort, if they want to work at Amazon, the answer is a resounding no. They've heard about that reputation. That's the true employer brand, and it's the existing employees largely that have conditioned that brand. The tools at your disposal here are really on the sort of in 5 buckets: the comp, the benefits, the career possibilities, the work environment, and the culture itself. I don't need to go into detail on all of the things and all the levers that you need to pull here. But that's how you can influence your brand. But really, fundamentally, you've got to do 2 things. You've got to know what the brand is, and you have to know how to influence. And it's not just related to your existing employees, or a large part of it, but as we're going to see in the employee life cycle, we need to take a much wider approach. So if we got the employer brand at the top. And so we marry that with the employer life cycle, or the employee life cycle, and retention. So there's 6 real phases to the employee life cycle. And they start, and this is really important, quite a bit of time before the actual person comes into the organization. I've heard many organizations believe that their employee life cycle begins, and I apologize for the typo there, I missed that one, begins at the onboarding or recruiting stage. No, it doesn't. It actually begins before that, and that's going to have a fundamental impact on how we deal with it. So you need to, the attraction part is really understanding who your target candidate is, and making sure that they have a good view, a good perception of that employer brand. And this is really where Amazon and others will say the fast food industry is struggling a lot right now, because the attraction part really isn't there, or they're struggling to do it. The recruiting is an experience in and of itself. What we're starting at, when we're at the 3rd phase of the stage, and the person still is just begun to work here. Right, so the onboarding experience is also crucial, and we need to understand how an applicant to candidate to employee lives through that experience. And then is where it widens out in terms of time, the development. This is where things like professional growth, the work experience, or the employee experience writ large, and everything we measure in terms of employee engagement takes hold. And that's really what leads to the decision to retain or not. And of course, the end of the employee life cycle is the separation, whether or not that employee leaves voluntarily, or they leave as directed in terms of either a layoff or a work termination or some sort. But even the separation isn't the end of the cycle. So we should be actually really draw a circular arrow around this, because the separation used to mean the end. And what's happened now, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, is that the separation is not the end, and it certainly doesn't have to be, because employees who leave maintain contact with the employees who stay. Social media has permitted that. Facebook pages, Instagram, all of those types of things allow for a continuation of the contact between the departed employee and the existing employee. And that has a fundamental and profound effect on our employee brand, or employer brand, pardon me. Well, first of all, you've got the Glassdoor effect, right? So if people are leaving with a bad experience, they're going to post on Glassdoor. And if you don't already, you should be monitoring your Glassdoor posts very, very closely to see how that is evolving, because that's one source of information. More importantly, the employees who stay are going to basically judge their experience by how the employees who leave are treated, right? So that's actually going to be a circular reference. And all of those experiences at the departure stage are going to influence our ability to attract, right? So it really is a circular thing. So how then do we need to look at it? Well, you know what? Most organizations, and your organization, we measure the engagement. We do our employee engagement surveys, and that's great, right? And we do our pulses and continuous listening and all those good things. But that really is only around these two phases here, around the retention and development. And yes, they have a big impact on our employer brand, but they certainly, as you can see by the other four that are untouched, they don't condition the employer brand altogether. We need to look at other stages. And how do we do that? Where do we do that? Well, first, some, and many of you probably do this too, you do your exit interviews. So some do measure the separation experience. But what you don't measure, and I've seen very, very few organizations do this, is when you're measuring your separation experience, you talk to the people who will leave to find out why they're leaving, right? Makes sense. Do you talk to the people who stay about their experience with the people who've left? Because there is a mourning period, especially if people are leaving involuntarily, if there's restructuring and layoffs and things like that going on, then the people who stay are going to have, if we don't find out what their experience is around that whole issue, that too is going to have a big impact, not only engagement, but on the employer brand. A lot fewer measure the onboarding experience, right? So you're going to do an onboarding survey. You're going to find out what the onboarding experience was like. Some will ask about the interview process and things like that. And that's all very good. And that's actually quite crucial, as I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes with our case examples. But very, very few organizations really look at the crucial link. And the crucial link here is the leading indicator for the whole rest. When we measure here, right, if we're measuring what people feel about the organization even before they apply, so the applicant and the target applicant stage, that's really the crucial link for the rest. And my case examples that I'm going to talk about shortly will illustrate why that is, right? So it really is, we need to be looking at the whole thing. Now, some of you might be sitting there and thinking, oh my God, he's just, this is for surveys and this is about money and this is about doing more work. No, actually not, because most of this you can do yourself, actually should do yourself. EPSI can provide expertise, certainly EPSI can provide logistics support, EPSI can actually do the surveys if that's what you want, but you don't need that, right? Most of these you can do on your own. The self-service platforms are fine for doing that. Certainly, we could help in terms of providing the expertise for which questions to ask, but it's not an expensive endeavor. It shouldn't be, right? Most of this can be done self-serve. And so what are we actually measuring then? We've got to take a data-driven preemptive approach to both attraction and retention, because that's really the message. What are we looking for? Well, if we go around the cycle, we're looking for, first of all, if we're not a huge brand like Amazon or McDonald's or what have you, that we're going to have 100% awareness, we need to know that our target candidates know we're looking. And what is our reputation amongst the target candidate, right? So basically, that's key. It's a key element of your your employer brand. And you can probably piggyback on your marketing department surveys, because your customers and your applicants are largely are going to be quite overlapping. And so you don't need to start creating your own survey. If you've got the resources to do that, that's great. Then there's the recruiting or onboarding survey. We need to know, and this is really crucial, as I'm going to explain in a minute, we need to know why people are attracted. Why did that applicant apply? What is it they're looking for? Because as soon as an applicant applies, then they have an expectation of what the work experience is going to be like. And that expectation is conditioned both by existing employees and who are posting on social media, but also the brand, the customer brand itself. So if I have, and you all have, if I mention to you a brand, let's say the Royal Bank of Canada, all of a sudden you're going to get some mental images, some visualizations of what it might be like to work at the Royal Bank of Canada, right? So that's part of that reputation amongst target candidates. If you then say, okay, wow, there's an application on or recruitment drive going on LinkedIn, I'm going to apply. As soon as that thought crosses that person's mind, your mind in this case, if you're thinking about it, you're going to have a predetermined notion of what you think and what you expect to happen in that career. We need to know what that is. And that's where many organizations fall short, because we don't know what that is. We think we know, but we don't really know. And I'll use an example to illustrate that. Again, we need to understand, once that applicant gets into our process, we need to know that recruiting experience. If any of you work for the federal government, I don't need to tell you the pain that is the recruiting experience and the onboarding experience for most. The recruiting experience, let's talk about the Public Service of Canada, right? In all their good intentions, that experience between the length of time, the types of interviews that they have to do, the testing, all that stuff, it's an arduous process, right? So, but many private sector processes can be just as arduous. And that conditions, again, the employee experience going in. And then we get around the horn here to development, of course, of our employee engagement surveys, training, competency, things like that, things that are showing, very, very important. I didn't put all of the dimensions of employee engagement there, but you can think about what they might be. Retention is another one. And I alluded to one of the things that very few organizations do. And if you do this, kudos to you. Yes, a lot do continuous listening and pulses to find out, what's on people's minds, but stay interviews have become really, really key. And that's one of the things, the weapons in your arsenal now, as we face the big quit. We don't need to wait for that person to say that they're leaving to do the exit interview. We should be doing stay interviews. We should be talking to the people that we want to keep and understand what it is it takes to keep them. What are their experiences like? That can be done either qualitatively with one-on-one interview. It can be done in a survey type of format, but I would think a series of one-on-one stay interviews is probably more effective. Why? Because it's showing that individual that that you truly care that they stay. So that stay interviews, I got that bolded because it really is a good weapon in your arsenal. But now when you're looking at measuring around this, there's so many ways to do it. social media, candidate surveys, onboarding surveys, and you can develop and implement these all on your own because the most expensive part of it is obtaining the lists, but you've got those. If you've got applicants and candidates, you've got those lists, right? And I would urge you, if you don't survey applicants who aren't recruited, you should be, right? And it really doesn't take a lot of effort or resources to set up a system to do that. A couple of days work maybe to set that up. So what are the key metrics that you're looking for then in this measurement process, and how do you measure them? Candidate awareness, reputation. So like I said before, you can put questions in your marketing and customer surveys if you're talking about candidates who aren't necessarily applying. And you've got a couple of questions here that you can use based on what you know of our organization. How likely would you be to apply to our position? Based on what you knew a month prior to applying, how would you have rated our organization as a place to work? And that's the Royal Bank effect, right? What I talked about before. So your data sources, you can do like a pre-selection applicant online survey. As soon as you got that person's email address, you got them on a list, and you can send them a very, very crisp, short couple of questions and get that data. The attraction criteria, that's the applicant online survey. What attracted you to apply for a position with us? Crucial question. Because if we get it wrong or we target things that we can't deliver, and I'm sort of setting up my case examples, then we're going to be in trouble, and we're going to accelerate the hamster wheel that we saw about. The candidate recruiting and onboarding experience, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to take you through all this detail. You'll be able to look. I'll point out a couple of things here, but you'll be able to. This is going to be circulated, and the video is going to be available. So you can look at this in more detail on your own. A couple of things I do want to point out, though. One key metric that you should be looking at is called the employee net promoter score. So if anybody is familiar with the customer experience net promoter score, you'll know what that is. But we do it on the employee side. What is it? It basically asks the question, how likely are you to recommend my organization to a friend as a great place to work, right? The net promoter score is simply the people who answer that they are likely or very likely to say yes, less the people that say that they're not likely or not at all likely. So you get a net score or net percentage of people that are going to recommend your organization. That's the net promoter, employer or employee net promoter score. Crucial measure, because what it means is if that score is very high, it means your people are working as brand ambassadors, employer brand ambassadors for them. But if that score is quite low, as we did in a recent survey, I just did one where the net promoter score was only around 10%. Basically, you had about 45% of people saying that they would recommend, but you had another 35% of people who said they wouldn't recommend. So you only got 10% plus there. And that means you're spinning the wheel because you got a lot of people that are detractors as well. So that's something that you need to address through the employer or the employee experience and employee engagement. Considering leaving, that's there. Are you currently looking for or thinking of accepting the job with another employer? You put that in your pulse surveys, you put that in your employee engagement survey, you've got that measure and you track that over time. Often I get the question, well, what do we should be looking for? You saw the previous slide. Roughly, if the number of people is answering yes is 25% or more, you should be getting concerned. If the number of people who prefer not to answer is 25% or more on top of that, then you really know that there is a turnover risk happening, right? And of course, the stay. How can we make your work experience more enticing to stay? So those are the things I'll touch on now. So I've been talking about, I've been promising this for a while. I'm going to talk about two concrete examples where this has come into play. So no, this is not the Royal Bank I'm talking about. It's another one. So it was a major Canadian bank. It was a couple of years ago. We were doing engagement surveys for them over years. And they were, being a major Canadian bank, they were quite, how should I say, confident might be the word, in their ability to recruit. They had no issue with applications. They were targeting highly ambitious university graduates, and that would obviously fit why, what a Canadian bank or major bank would be looking for. And so what they didn't know until after was they thought that being a major Canadian bank, they could basically say to people, or infer, which is probably what they did. They assumed that their applicants would say, we're a huge bank, so there's going to be rapid career advancement at the bank. And lo and behold, after the fact, we found out that indeed the major, that was a big, one of the key expectations, but they didn't know it yet. They did employee surveys, but they did employee engagement. And so they saw in their employee engagement that they were having issues around professional growth and career advancement. A lot of people felt that they weren't advancing well enough, but they didn't really put two and two together until they started to find out, and this is really, we've been doing the employee engagement survey for a number of years, but their turnover was, their engagement was dropping and their turnover was increasing. And not only was their turnover increasing, but the exit surveys that we were doing as well were showing that the people that they were hiring in the most recently, so in fewer than 3 years, half of them were leaving within 3 years. Half. So there's the hamster wheel in action, right? So, but they, and their exit interviews were, weren't really saying why that is. And then when we said, well, you should be talking not necessarily only to the people who are leaving, talk about the people who are coming in and find out what it is that is attracting them. And surely enough, people were saying they're coming in thinking that, I'm going to have a rapid career, and I'm going to have rapid salary increases, and the bank wasn't delivering on that. And so people were leaving. And so you had the hamster wheel in motion. And once they found out, once we did those surveys of the top end, so if I go back, doing this piece, this crucial link here, then they were able to sort of start to say they were going to, in their promotion, they were tempering their expectations. Okay, yes, there is movement, but it's, it's conditional. And what happened was the candidates that made it through and were hired were interested in other benefits. Yes, professional growth and development, career advancement was important to them, but so were other things like flexibility, like work-life balance, things that hadn't necessarily they've been targeting before. And so their turnover started, at least the turnover within the 3 years started to drop. And that's really the effect of measuring right around the circle. And of course, when you apply that to today's world, that's basically, we'll come to a few of those strategies in a second. But if we know what we can, what our strengths are and what we can attract, and we build on that, and then we deliver that. So if people are coming for high salaries and we don't deliver on that, we're going to be accentuating the wheel, and we don't want to be doing that. Once we do recruit, we want people to stay, right? Our other example is really a good best practice case. So this is a health services organization, provincial. I won't say. Their target was a little bit different. Their target was healthcare students, grads, out of province practitioners, doctors, nurses, orderlies, nurse practitioners, things like that. They were not necessarily attracted as much by rapid career growth and salary. They were attracted by stability, shift flexibility, and were the key attractions there. But they knew that. This organization was measuring the applicant stage, and they were measuring, we were doing onboarding, we were doing engagement, we were doing exit. And sure enough, what we also saw was we were able to predict. So what people were saying was that if the key attractiveness feature for them was rapid career growth, we were able to predict to a reasonable degree of certainty how long that they were going to stay in the organization. And so that fundamentally changed their employer branding strategy to focus on the things that they could deliver and were strong in delivering, right? So that's really what we're what we're talking about here. And this organization had one of the lowest pandemic or post-pandemic turnover rates in Canada and the highest engagement, notwithstanding the issues around turnover caused by the burnout and the workload and things like that. One of the reasons for that was because we knew we were recruiting people who were going to be more resilient. And this was pre-pandemic. People who knew that they were going to, yes, shift flexibility was important, but the willingness to do odd shifts, the midnight shift, the weekend shift, they knew that going in. So yes, the pandemic put an enormous strain on those folks, but because a lot of folks expected that going in, were highly engaged and of course dedicated to serving the public and providing the healthcare services needed, they had lower turnover than some of the others that were not really either measuring or managing the employee, the whole cycle. So what are some of the strategies and tactics that we can do to survive and thrive through the big quit? Because the big quit is going to be here for at least another year, maybe two, before things sort of flatten out and the scales even up. What are some of the things we can do? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that we remember the people who stay. What's happening now is many resources, especially in HR, are diverted to the recruitment effort because we're losing people. And so we got to replace them. And so we need to, amp up the recruiting and all the, and pour money into that. Some of the large organizations are pouring advertising dollars into that as well. We're starting to see the advertising agencies love this, right? Because not only they're advertising the product, they're advertising for people. And so we're seeing that, but we've got to maintain our focus. Yes, we need to dedicate resources to recruitment, but we need to do it smart. We need to understand what our target candidate is looking for and be able to deliver. And that's really key. And so there's some thought required there. We don't want to be recruiting people that are all about salary increases when we can't deliver on salary increases, right? So we got to be really careful. And that it takes a little bit longer, but we need to also focus on those who stay, right? And I'll tell you a little bit how. We also have to realize, what? There's a silver lining to this cloud, and that is there are opportunities that high turnover brings. For all of us who've been struggling with change management over the last, and many of my mandates have involved, change resistance, change management, measuring change, all those types of things. When you have high turnover, you got a lot of new people coming in. Yes, that creates a lot of stresses. But it also creates an opportunity to accelerate the changes that we want to make, because you can bring in new skills, you can bring in new attitude, you can bring in people that the change isn't really a change for them, it's what they're walking into. I'll give you an example of that. For years and years, and I still do a lot of work with the Trade Commissioner Service, the Global Affairs Canada. And we did a really big change initiative. Took about 3 or 4 years from beginning to end. And at the beginning, it had all of the issues that associated with change management. But towards the end, with the new cohorts of individuals coming on stream, they didn't see it as change at all. They saw it, this is the way we should be working. Why were you working like that before? Right? So you can focus on some of those opportunities. The other thing is make it okay to leave, right? You can't force an employee to stay. We can entice, and we'll talk about how we do that in a second. We can entice people to stay. We can improve the employee experience, but we can also make it okay to leave. And what we're talking about here is, don't think about the person leaving, severing and ending that relationship. I mean, if the employee, if their experience was a good one, and they might be looking for career advancement, more money, they might be, you know, the grass being greener, they're going to keep in touch and with their friends and colleagues that are still there. And we can have a lifelong relationship with that person through social media, through you know, a Facebook page or a LinkedIn group for our company or our organization. And people will, you know, they'll stay, the alumni stay in touch. And so we can sort of re-entice when they find out that the grass is not greener on the other side, and they're going to, some come back. And when I was talking about that Provincial Health Services organization, they incorporated that into their strategy. They built a Facebook page for people who were leaving and things like that, kept in touch. And lo and behold, about, you know what, 20% of their new positions or re-recruited positions were people who came back after 6 months, after a year, finding out that the grass wasn't ever, you know, necessarily green. Treat your employees like your customers, your stakeholders. The paradigm has completely shifted. Our employees, by now, we can't take them for granted. We need to treat them as if they have a choice of doing business with us, just like our customers. No longer can we have the mentality that, you know what, and I still see this too often, and I see this with my age cohort, oh, they're lucky to have a job, they're lucky to work in our great organization. No, that doesn't fly anymore. And when you start treating your employees like they have a choice to do business with you, you treat them very differently. And your employees are the ones that are going to attract your customers. And that comes throughout the entire employee experience. Re-recruit them is one of the ways we do that. How do we re-recruit them? Well, you know what? We find out, just like we're recruiting our new employees, we recruit our existing employees by finding out what it is they need, right? Finding out how we can make the experience better. And that goes to the measurement that I was talking about. We need to reward them. This is especially true coming out of the pandemic. Some provinces are still in it. We need to reward those loyal soldiers who stuck with us. And we need to look at, yes, revisit total compensation, total rewards, but with a caveat, and we'll talk about that on the next slides. It's not about the money, and I'll get to that in a second. And that's part of the re-recruit process is, you know what, a bonus, incentive, days off. There's so many ways, and the employees themselves, if you do those stay interviews I'm talking about, they're going to tell you what it is they value and how you can value their contribution. So don't just, you know, put the money, put the resources in amping up salaries to attract people. That, by the way, is going to backfire on you. That's going to accelerate the hamster wheel, because people, just like if you've ever been, you know, for your cable or your phone, the people who are attracted by these new bonus offers and they don't offer the same thing to the existing customers, how do you feel about that? Same thing with your employees if you start throwing money at attraction, right? But most of all, the real keys here are two words: flexibility and connectedness. You need to prepare for the hybrid workplace of the future. You need to provide time options, place of work options. It's one size is not going to fit all anymore. I've worked with a couple of organizations that are really on the cusp or ahead of the curve on this, and are, you know, adapting work packages for different situations. Mental health, well-being, and support. Management behavior that encourages productivity and engagement. If our managers are compensated based on productivity measures, like sales, like commissions, like things like that, without thinking about the employee side, well, if that's what they're going to manage to what they're measured on. Well, if you manage the employee experience and engagement alongside that, it tempers that, right? They have to think about, it's not just a good thing to do, they are also measured on how well they do that. So Are they measured on turnover rates? Are they measured on some of those metrics I talked about before, which is turnover intent, right? That's probably as much an important metric as the actual turnover rate. So we can look at building those into our management compensation and performance evaluation structures. Don't do these things. Don't throw money at the problem, even if you had the money to throw. All that does is it attracts the wrong people, and it ticks off the people that you have in place, right? Yes, you need to look at your total rewards to see what it is, how we can value our contribution better. In some cases, that might merit compensation increases. But in most cases, the penchant to think, okay, we've been underpaying, so now we have to pay more, can backfire. And I already talked about that. And talent poaching, the people who are going to leave you for the grass being greener are the same, or leave another organization, are the same people who are going to leave you when they think the grass is greener. So that's just another thing that accelerates the wheel. So on that note, folks, I've gone along a little bit long, so we do have a few more minutes for questions and discussions. And I see, did you want to go through that, Cass, or did you want me to just read these here?
Yeah, I can go through them if you want.
Okay, please do.
First of all, Norm, I just want to say thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and insightful. And we do have some very good questions in the chat, so I'll start with the first one. From Emily, would you suggest doing an onboarding survey after the employee has been hired and been with the company for a week or month, or even after probation?
Okay, so there's actually science to this. So the onboarding survey, I don't want you to forget about the applicant piece. So the applicant and pre-application measures are equally, if not, they're equally important. So don't forget about those pieces, right? So the person that does come in, yes, you do an onboarding survey. Ideally, you do it at 3 intervals, at 2 weeks prior, or 2 weeks post, 1 month post, and 3 months post. Why? Because at each stage, they're going to have different experiences. So in the 2 weeks post, what you want to measure is you want to measure what the actual recruiting process was like, that experience, how long did it take? Was it arduous? And the actual, the coming in, the onboarding itself. Did you get your computer? All of those logistic things. Then you need to do 1 month, hence, to see how they're beginning to socialize. Do they have a buddy? Are they integrating well? Do they feel included? And then 3 months, now you're starting to ask about things like the same things you would ask in an employee engagement survey. So you're really looking for that level of socialization. So onboarding isn't a one and done deal. It's a continuous process. The Provincial Health Service organization that I did structured their survey that way, and we found out new things at each stage of the game. They did rationalize to go to 2 surveys instead of 3, mostly because of, I won't call it survey fatigue, that's the wrong thing. It was just to make it more efficient. We were asking the same questions, we were just doing it in 2 stages rather than 3. Okay, but the real key here is not to think of it as a one and done onboarding survey. It has to be staged. Next.
Yes, so next question is, what do you suggest to HR counselor who totally agree with you but are having hard times to convince the upper management?
Show them the turnover statistics. That's the one that, the fear and the shock and awe. And it doesn't have to be your turnover statistics. They can be general or industry wide or wherever you can find them. But you show your leadership that people are leaving. And if you can do a pulse survey to ask a couple of those questions, are you thinking of leaving, that type of thing? And you're going to see, in today's day and age, unless your organization is an absolute superstar, and or you've got the richest golden handcuffs going, which basically means you're overpaying benefits and salary to the nth degree, and some organizations in Ottawa are doing that, then you're going to start to see that metric is going to be pretty high. And so that's the ammunition you take to senior leadership to say, the people haven't left yet, we can still stop it. So that's really the impetus for action.
Thank you. Next one, what are the differences between stay interviews and performance management dialogues? If they are different, can they be combined? And how often should we do them, stay interviews?
Oh, no, do not combine them. No, 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 no. This is so different. This is not performance measurement and management. A stay interview is you're sitting down with your employee and you're basically asking them what their experience is like. Have they, you can ask them if they consider leaving, but you're going to have a bias there. So I wouldn't necessarily believe the response in a face-to-face. But you're showing them through that conversation that you really care about the reasons that they would stay or leave. And what does it take to keep that going? It's not about performance management. It's a completely separate discussion. And if you combine the discussion, it's actually going to backfire, because then what they're going to do, what they're going to believe is, oh, well, the only reason they want me to stay is because I'm performing well and they don't want to lose a high performer. No, you can see the cynicism's creeping. The stay interview is a stay interview. The performance management conversation is something that's completely different. Okay, hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Norm.
My pleasure.
I don't see any other questions. Was there? Oh, we have another one that just came in. You mentioned exit interviews. What about when you have to let someone go? You would not be able to get them to do an interview, but would you suggest an interview for the other employees regarding what happened? Or would an open discussion be okay with the employees?
Actually, you can. And you can do an exit interview now with the online technology, right? You can send that person an exit interview before they leave, because once they leave the organization, the proverbial building, even if they're working at home, forget about trying to contact them again. That's where it's going to be too bitter. But before they leave, and not the day that they get their notice, by the way, roughly about a week, usually there's a 2-week period at least. So, and if there's not, then it's probably somebody I wouldn't want to be interviewing. But somebody who's given notice, the 2 weeks, about a week in, you can still send them that survey, or you can do the face-to-face interview. So yeah, you can still, even if you're letting them go, if you're letting them go on good terms, if you're letting them go because of restructuring, all of those reasons, they still have, you know what, they're going to be sad, they're going to be disappointed, they're going to be dejected, but they still have an experience that they can relate to the organization, which is very valuable. So I would not dismiss it. But with people that you're letting go, make sure you get them before they actually hand in their computer and their login information and things like that. And you can decide as a judgment call whether or not that should be an online survey or actually a conversation. So I think, Cass, we're just about out of time.
Yeah, we're coming close to the end, yes.
Okay.
Perfect. So in that case, this will close today's webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Norm, for this presentation. And it will be made available online shortly this week. So if ever you need to revisit it or want to share it with anybody in your contacts, feel free. And if ever you have any questions, you have Norm's information at the screen right now where you can send him your questions as well.
Yep. Thank you. Merci tout le monde. Bonne journée. Have a great day, everybody.